All right, so with us today is Tara Mandalaywala. She's an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She's also a Duke alum, go Duke. And she's going to tell us a little bit about the research that she does on kids. She also does research on non-human primates, which is equally fascinating, but not part of today's lecture. But so you can follow up with her website if you want to learn more about that. But Tara, thank you for joining me.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, so this is just a broad question I like to ask everyone as we get started, but what are the research questions that most guide the work that you do?
So across both my work with humans and non-human primates, I've always been very interested in how the environments and communities that individuals grow up in shape the way that they come to view the world around them and how they come to view themselves as sort of a cog within that larger framework. So that's kind of the overarching frame that informs most of what I do.
Okay, and I say this to everyone, but your answer to that, it's self-evident to me why that's an important thing to study, but I also like to give the expert the opportunity to expand on that in their own words. So why do you think that this is such an important topic worthy of study?
So I think there's a couple reasons that it's important, and it depends a little bit on what your ultimate goals are. So you could just be sort of like me, kind of intrinsically interested in this question, this idea of something, especially in young individuals, children, or non-human sort of infants, how these ideas and beliefs and really complex thoughts form out of maybe nothing, or form out of some sort of innate understandings or biases or heuristics that individuals are born with. So that's one piece of it, just sort of understanding how these things form out of nowhere. There's also a lot of value in thinking of things developmentally when we're trying to understand how we might be able to use this information to improve the world around us and to intervene. So if we know that right now is a really prime example, as people are becoming increasingly aware of the prevalence of things like racial bias and gender inequities in the world around us, how can we hope to sort of fight against those or to reduce them if we don't even understand where they come from? So the work that I do, I see is sort of laying the first step and laying some of that groundwork and helping us understand where do these different sort of problematic beliefs come from? What do they develop in response to? And how can we use that information to reduce their very existence?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting that you frame it in terms of where they come from, because I'm sure we also see significant changes over time from where they originally start to at least adult thinking on these topics. So are there ways that you think kids fundamentally differ from adults in the way that they think about social categories like race or gender?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. So one of the ways that I think kids are most interestingly different from adults is that they're forming all of these ideas and these beliefs about the world around them, but these ideas and beliefs aren't necessarily valenced. So they're not putting sort of value on the fact that when they look at men and women, they see that as two sort of objectively different categories, but they're not necessarily thinking that men or women are better than the other. And the same can be applied to lots of different social categories. So I think kids are different in that they're making sense and they're categorizing the world around them, but they're not making other sorts of maybe higher level attributions on top of that, at least not for a little while. Whereas we know with adults, a lot of these things, the very act of categorization is sort of intimately tied up with the act of forming attitudes or expressing attitudes towards different groups. But at the same time, I think there are some ways in which we're fundamentally similar across the lifespan. So if we think about the fact that one thing that seems to emerge quite early and is also present in other species are these types of in-group biases and a tendency to have some preferences that you do display, and often preferences for those that are closest to you, so whether this be kin or friends or sort of, again, in-group members across racial, gender, ethnic, whatever lines. So in that way, even though kids might not know what they're doing, they do sometimes show some of these preferences as soon as they're able to sort of identify themselves in a group, whether that's consciously or not. And I think that is something that tends to be kind of consistent across the lifespan.
Do you find that the preferences that kids report tend to be more pronounced, their in-group preferences, than adults?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you guys have talked about this in your class yet at this point, but thinking about social desirability, right? So when kids are really little, and this is both like the wonderful and horrifying thing about working with, say, preschoolers, is that they have no sort of compunction against expressing statements that we as adults might find horrifying. So explicitly saying like, oh, well, I like white people better, or I want to play with that white kid. is something that kids will often quite freely say, and adults just wouldn't, right? Like as adults, we're hesitant to even say like white or black. So I think that sometimes, especially quite early in development, they do express this more. And we know that there's this sort of curve in which they then realize that they shouldn't say certain things. And so then if we ask them the same types of questions, so we ask a 10-year-old the same question we would ask a 4-year-old, we might get very different responses, even though the underlying belief there might be the same. And this is where things like implicit measures or speeded categorization tasks, those kinds of things might come in really handy.
Yeah, so to jump off of that, I've had a developmental psychologist in the past tell me that when she works with kids, she doesn't bother with implicit measures. And so my students should by now be experts in implicit measures, at least among adults. What do you think is the role of implicit measures when it comes to researching kids?
Again, sort of jumping off from what I said previously, I think that in some cases it doesn't buy you a whole lot. It's a lot of work to try and sort of train them and get them using implicit measures. And then sometimes you just end up with extra noisy data. Data from kids in general is really noisy anyway. The other thing that I found in some of my own work is that when we use implicit, so we use like a race implicit association test with 4-year-olds, we actually find that even on sort of the training, they make a ton of errors. And in my own work, I try not to use category labels with kids because I don't want to give them the category. I really care what they're sort of spontaneously paying attention to and using. So in my studies, when we've done this, we just get sort of unusable data. I have some colleagues who do explicitly say category labels when they're asking kids and training them to do the categorizations, and they get very different results. So again, I think that there can be value. It depends on exactly what your question is, and I think it also really depends on the age.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. We can move a little bit into the specific paper we talked about. So I was really interested from a methodological standpoint in this, the use of the rope task. And it was a new task that you created. I think, was this the first time that you used it in this paper?
Yep.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about what the rope test looks like, but also, why you felt the need to create this new measure?
So the rope task was adopted from work that's been done in adults, the MacArthur Subjective Status Scale. So I actually really wish in the paper I'd called it the ladder task instead of the rope task. It makes it unnecessarily complicated and different. But that's the general premise, where you introduce a kid. In our case, we had 6 rungs, and they were aligned vertically. It was really fun for the kids, and this is a key for developmental work. Make it fun for them so they think they're playing a game and not doing a study. And we had a little rope that was tied around each of these pegs, which was a screw into a board, and they could put different stimuli and cards on the board. And in this way, we trained them to think that kids at the top of the rope have lots of toys and new clothes, and they always get to pick the games that everyone plays at recess and the snacks that everyone plays at snack time. Kids at the bottom of the rope don't have any new toys or new clothes, and they never get to pick the games or snacks, but kids can go anywhere in this rope. And then we trained them on some comprehension questions. Here's a stick figure kid. Has lots of toys, lots of new clothes, always gets to pick the games. Where do they go? Do this for all of the different sort of positions. And then we asked them to put themselves on the rope so we could get an idea of how do they view their own social status in lieu of these sort of dimensions that we set up for them. And then we asked them to put targets that varied in gender, so a boy and a girl on the rope, or that varied in race, 2 gender matched, so a white boy, a black boy, or a white girl and a black girl. And using this, we could look to see both how they viewed their own status, but then also were they making sort of stereotypical attributions of social status for these different sort of category dimensions. And I totally forgot about the second part of your question.
The second part was, okay, so why did you feel the need to introduce this task instead of relying on past measures? So for example, you compared this to the wealth matching task where you present 2 houses that, now you have to correct me, but I think one just looks nicer than the other, and you ask people who lives in this house and who lives in the other house, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So yes, that's a great question. The reason that we decided to use a new measure, develop something, was because, and this is another potential quirk of working with children, in these wealth matching tasks, we find that from about 3.5 or 4 years of age, kids are already above chance in saying, oh, the white kid lives in the nicer house and the black kid lives in the less nice house. So it seems like very early in development, kids are fully aware of this sort of stereotype that's conflating race with wealth. But there are some critiques against these types of measures sort of along 2 dimensions. One is that because these houses vary in sort of quality, the kids that are participating in the studies might also be engaging in some sort of affective tagging. So they're saying, I like this nicer house better, and I like this white kid better. And so I'm going to say that the white kid lives in the nicer house, even though I don't necessarily have a belief about race and wealth being conflated. The other reason that we wanted to sort of develop a new measure was because in these forced choice paradigms, they're kind of brute force. So you're almost forcing the kid to answer in sort of a way that, even if they don't have a strongly held stereotype, might be picking up on something that's very like lightly held. So it's a good task in a lot of ways, and I think it picks up on some things, but there are some of these critiques with it that we thought having a task where we had more of a scalar measure, so between 1 and 6. We also on this task had them put each of the stimuli on individually, so they could put both of the targets on the same peg if they wanted to, so they could respond in an egalitarian manner if they wanted. Those are some of the reasons. Oh, and the third thing actually was that with the rope task, the nice thing is you can change the benchmarks. So in our case, we gave them information about resources and social power, but in future studies, and this is something that in my lab we're working on now, you can say, I'm just going to give you information about resources, or just about power, or just about prestige. And in that way, you can start to isolate which social dimensions kids might be associating with particular aspects of social status.
So it's nice that you mentioned both resources and social power there, because what I thought was interesting about your prompt in the paper that we reviewed is that your prompt was a combination of the two. It was both who has the newest toys, which I would imagine is very closely correlated with wealth in kids' perceptions at least, and who decides on what snacks we eat or what games we play, which doesn't necessarily have to map onto to wealth. So why did you make the decision to combine these two in your test? And I thought it was interesting that when you combine the two of them in race, there were no differences, right? And so do you think that this can tease apart how wealth and social power don't necessarily go together as strongly as kids versus adults? So that was a very long question. So I'm going to revisit the first part. The first part was, why did you feel the need to combine the two of them in this prompt?
So there's the scientifically acceptable answer, and then there's a little bit of the real answer. So the scientifically acceptable one, which is also true, is that we weren't sure that this rope task would work in kids. And so sometimes in these types of situations, you give them as much information as possible, knowing that you're going to sacrifice a little bit of precision. So we're like, well, maybe social dominance isn't actually salient enough to kids. So if we just give them that cue, then we won't necessarily know. And same with just giving them cues to resources on this, again, sort of scalar measure. So that was part of the rationale. The other part was, I think that if we could go back and do it all again, we probably would have done like a third condition where we had one with the houses task and the just cues to resources on the ladder, and then one with houses and one with just cues to social dominance on the ladder. But again, you can't do everything in one study, so that is why we have
I thought it was interesting in that not finding a racial difference was really striking to me for all the research that you referenced previously about how cute kids can be to things like wealth differences. But so going back to the second part of that question, maybe what are your thoughts on maybe your task is revealing that wealth and social power are less closely connected among kids than they might be among adults? Like, I don't know, I'm speaking in generalizations here, but like the law of the playground can be very fickle, and what makes one kid cool at the moment can be kind of totally disconnected to their wealth or resources, perhaps less so among adults.
I think that's very plausible and would be super interesting, right? Like, and that's kind of the cool thing in doing developmental work as well, is that because you might expect that these things are more disconnected in childhood than they are in adulthood, where they've all sort of congealed into this abstract concept of status that contains lots of different pieces of information. Whereas in children, yeah, like maybe their status concept starts with something like physical size. So you're really just focusing on sort of these things that evolutionarily might have been really important in paying attention to threat as well, and things you had to pay attention to just to stay alive. And then that slowly moves into something like social dominance, and then later on comes to incorporate other things like resource holding. So you could make a lot of different sort of just so stories about what the developmental trajectory might look like. But that is, again, something that's nice because we can actually go through and test that.
Yes, hopefully you do. I'd be interested to see what you find. Okay, so zooming out a little bit, now you're just putting on the hat of the expert across all developmental science, because we don't get a lot of that in this class. So I warned you about this question. Let's pretend there's a pie that makes up all the ways kids learn about social categories in the world. And parts of that pie have to be attributed to their parents, their friends, and the media. What do you think plays the biggest role in shaping kids' perceptions of these social categories?
All of them and none of them at the same time. It's like my passion is trying to understand the way that the environment, and when I think of the environment, I'm thinking of all of these different factors, like the way that the environment shapes children's social cognition. And it is such a complex and like dastardly question. It's really hard to pull them apart, right? Like, because kids aren't just getting one piece at a time. They're kind of getting it all together. And during the time periods when you're like, well, but what about when they're infants? When they're infants, like really what they're getting is from their parents or from their caregivers. And you're like, well, yes, but also their cognitive abilities when they're infants are quite different from their cognitive abilities when they're 2 years old or 3 years old. And so how much can you say is due to differences in the type of input that they're getting versus how much of it is due to differences in their cognitive capabilities and what information they can actually take in and process and remember. Like all of these lower level systems like memory and associative processes like are super important and are developing along the same time. So sometimes I feel like I'm doing a slightly hopeless thing and trying to figure out where these things come from.
And to further critique my own question, these things are mutually reinforcing. So, your parents determine the kids that you hang out with, and the kids you hang out with determine the media that you intake. So, I thought it was just a shot in the dark there, but that's a very fair question to say. Like, that's too simplistic of a perception of all this. So wrapping up here, I have two final questions for you. So a lot of students in psychology are very interested, rightfully so, in this question of developmental science, and they come and they ask me about how to do this work, and I have to shrug my shoulders. So do you have any advice for people who want to get more interested in doing research on kids?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing would be contact people who are actually doing developmental research at your institution and ask them if they have any sort of credit opportunities or sort of internships for you to work. The kind of good thing for people who are interested in developmental work is that it's super labor intensive, right? So like it takes a lot to collect the data from the kids because you have to often do it in person or at the very least sort of hold interviews with kids. We can't put a survey up online and ask kids to take it because they can't read. It's fair. And their parents control access. And then after we get these, we often videotape these sessions. So then when we bring the data back to the lab, not only do we end up entering the data, we also then have a second person rewatch the video to make sure we didn't make any errors. And kids speak also is often all over the place. So we often have to have multiple people sort of watch to make sure we can actually understand what the kid is saying or what they're doing. And that's all just before you can actually take the data and turn it into anything that can be analyzable. So there's lots of different pieces to get involved, and I think it's great if you can find a lab where you can see everything from sort of study conception and design, and study design and developmental is also really cool because you have to be creative in how you think about things because kids do not think about things the same way adults do. So there should be lots of opportunities, even during this remote COVID era, lots of people are moving data collection online, and that just needs even more videos. So there will certainly be enough to do.
Oh, yeah, I like that answer. It definitely seems like a very collaborative effort. So you get to meet a lot of people while you're doing it. And, when you're translating something from an adult abstract concept into something a kid can do, it takes probably a lot of ingenuity and creativity. So great answer. All right, last question. So what are the questions that you think that you most want your field to answer in the next 5 or 10 years? So what are the things that you really want to see a lot of progress on when I have you back in 10 years?
Oh my goodness. That's a good question. I think there are probably two things. And I'm biased, these are two things that I care a lot about. One is that I want there to be more study of both cognitive processes and environmental input. So the sort of like cognition and environment interaction piece. And I think this is something that, again, is really hard to do in kids. There's a lot more in adults, but in kids is really a great time to do it because the types of questions that you can answer, both in terms of practical and applied nature, but also in terms of our conceptual understanding of what children's brains are actually doing. So that's one. I think that there should be more integration in the environment. And then I guess the second piece, which is related to that, is there is so much work that's been done on samples of convenience in developmental psych. So developmental psych, right, is already hard to do. You've got to go out and find families, and they have to be willing to share their children with you, and you have to come up with creative ways of doing it, and it's very labor intensive. And so it's not unreasonable that most of the stuff that we know is very weird, very much done on like university professors' kids. So I think now is a time to really start to look more broadly and to understand the experiences, not just of sort of white middle class or upper class kids, but also kids of color and kids that are coming from different communities. Low income kids are notoriously hard to get access to and to include in your studies because the constraints that those families have on their time is even higher. But I think it's really important, and we can't have a truly comprehensive understanding of human nature if we're not asking questions of everybody.
Right. I mean, that's a great answer. People who've watched a couple of these videos will pick up on certain themes that a lot of people bring up, and you're extending that definitely into kids' research as well. So, Tara, thank you so much for telling us about your own work, but about the developmental perspective on intergroup relations. I had a really great time.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.